Mr. Balfour made his infamous and typically perfidious fork-tongued declaration, just I think 142 words long. 142 words that have produced nearly 100 years of misery and disaster in the Middle East. I had to pass also, almost every day, the room in which Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot, the former, a quite remarkable figure actually, about whom I've been reading much more recently. Mark Sykes was a British MP, a kind of ex officio cabinet minister to the war cabinet in the First World War, who called himself an expert on the Middle East, and who was one of the first of what would be quite common actually in the near century that has elapsed since his work. Sykes hated Jews. He was a vicious, foul anti-Semite, but he loved Israel, and he loved the idea of Israel. Like so many, he saw Zionism as a means of ensuring that he would never have to look at Jewish people on the streets of London. He talked openly about, we'll be able to clean the East End of London if we can create Israel and by one means or another, encourage or otherwise, the Jews of the East End of London to go and live in Palestine. He hated Arabs also, whom he described as venal and lazy, and all the casual racist epithets that were thrown about by British imperialists openly at the time, not so openly now, though sometimes sotto voce. Sykes and his counterpart Picot, the French Orientalist from the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Ministry and the French Foreign Policy establishment, literally in a room at the Palace of Westminster, at a time when a quarter of the world and a third of all humanity were being ruled from that building, sat down with a blank map of the Middle East and with their pencils and rulers literally drew lines on the map and invented countries, divided territories into different countries, and began the task of plotting which corrupt king would be placed on which throne. They had no concept that they'd have to shift to corrupt presidents as well as kings when they were doing this work. In other words, the modern Middle East, as we have come to know it, was an invention in the Houses of Parliament by the Thames in London. These states that have become apparently permanent, and the dictators who were apparently permanent, who presided over them, were in fact a 20th century invention of the British and French imperialists at the time. The Americans had not yet arrived on the stage. But I met a man a few years ago, I don't know if he's still alive, he was 93, a man called Dabbas in Jordan. And in the course of talking with him, I asked him, you were alive before there was anything called Jordan. It didn't exist. None of these countries existed as separate states. Lebanon and Syria and Palestine and Jordan were known as Bilad al-Sham, the land of Sham. And I asked him, what did you call yourself when you were young? And he answered, after a few moments' reflection, we were Arabs. They weren't Jordanians. They didn't have a national flag. They were Arabs. And they believed that they were the same, similar at least, to all the Arabs from Marrakesh to Bahrain. That this was one Arab people with one language, one God, one common culture. And they included, by the way, a significant number of Jews who had lived in Jerusalem in particular for many, many centuries as neighbors and friends of the Muslims and the Christians who also lived there. Much the same as Dr. Kamal described his relationship with many of today's Jews who reject Israel. But this division of the Arab world was, of course, entirely to the selfish interests of the imperial powers. And they squabbled like cats and dogs. They squabbled, with the British perfidious to the last, cheating the French, saying one thing to the Arab revolt, that Colonel Lawrence was attached to, one thing to Faisal, one thing to the Arabs about subsequent independence if they would join the British war effort against the Turkish part of the German alliance. And a completely different thing to the French and to themselves in their inner councils. It really does repay study, I say, in this venerable place of study, just how venal the conduct of our country was in the Middle East. And when you hear William Hague, little Willie Hague, opining his great feelings for the security, safety, human rights of the Arab people, it's as well to remember that he sits in the very office where Balfour sat. He walks the very corridors where Sykes and Picot did their dirty job. And of course, the purpose was to loot, to divide and rule, the better to loot and steal the resources of the people of that region, which were even then considerable, and later, with the importance of oil and gas, became very much more considerable still. In fact, there was a debate I've just been reading about between Sykes and Picot over exactly what line the British wanted. And the rubric of Sykes and the British government, that they wanted a line drawn from Acre in Palestine to Mosul in Iraq. And they wanted it for their own resources, and they wanted it to protect, as they put it, the approaches to India, which was then the jewel in their imperial crown. The Sykes-Picot agreement has become one of the most successful political imperial policies in all human history. It has kept the Arabs divided and weak all this time, and they are still divided and weak. If they were united, imagine all that land, all that oil, all that gas, all that water, 350 million of them. They'd be a superpower in the world, instead of a group of people grouped around a league, which is very much the Vauxhall Conference League. That's a lower division for those who don't follow football. The purposes are clear, but their success has been stupendous. Now you have Arabs ready to die for a flag which was invented by the British in Westminster. You have Arabs who define themselves in places like Lebanon, for example, as not Arabs at all, but Lebanese and maybe Phoenicians or some other fancy talk. It's been enormously successful. And these Arab revolutions in the last 12 months have begun to threaten the very foundations of that system. And so, because a scorpion stings because it's a scorpion, imperialism has to come up with a new plan to divide people. The fake nationalities and the kings and the presidents are falling like bricks. So, what new wheeze or old wheeze reheated can we bring forward? Perhaps to ensure another century of division, weakness, corruption and theft for the people of the Arab area. And you know where I'm heading with this. This deliberate Western policy of encouraging the division of the Muslim people on a sectarian basis is the new Sykes-Picot. It's Sykes-Picot 2. That doesn't mean there are no real divisions between Sunni and Shia. Doesn't mean that there are not tensions intrinsically, inherently there for 1400 years. But if you can devise a policy, am I going on too long, Andrew? If you can devise, if you can devise a policy which makes that division, that sectarian division, the primary division in the Muslim world, then you are guaranteed strife, conflict, weakness, and a continuation of the imperial system for another century. And that's why you get such grotesque, as Seamus pointed out in his wonderful article last week in The Guardian, such grotesque spectacles as Mrs. Clinton announcing a new organization once they failed to get their way in the United Nations, called Friends of Democratic Syria, led by Bahrain, which is murdering the democracy protesters in its own streets, all the while joining, indeed sponsoring, the Friends of Democratic Syria. Saudi Arabia, which has actually invaded and is occupying Bahrain, the better to murder the democracy protesters there, and has always murdered the democratic protesters in its own country, and where there is no freedom of any kind, no liberty of any kind, the unfreest country on the earth, is a sponsor of the Friends of Democratic Syria. Qatar, where there is equally no democracy at all, but there seems to be lots of money, which might explain the situation we're in now, where all roads, even the World Cup, seem to be headed for Doha. Not me, although thanks to Dr. Kamal, I'm free now to go to Egypt. I'm banned from Qatar. So I can speak my mind without fear or favour on that question. But none of which is to say. And I said this in the last meeting to a very large audience of Shiite Muslims in Maida Vale. I don't say one thing in one place and a different thing in another, not least because there are always cameras what you say. None of which means that there are not real issues in Syria. The fact that there's a foreign conspiracy, an imperialist conspiracy, using its stooges in the Gulf, of course, is clear. A blind man could see it. But that doesn't mean that the continuation of more than 40 years of one family rule in Syria can be countenanced by anyone who believes in democracy, anyone who believes in freedom. These dictatorships, all of them, must come to an end. And the question of how they can come to an end was dealt with by Seamus in the article in The Guardian very clearly. There has to be negotiation, there has to be a new constitution, there has to be parliamentary elections, there has to be presidential elections, the rights of minorities must be protected, and heaven knows Syria has enough minorities, 26 different, patchwork quilt, of 26 different nationalities and confessions and even religions. The Syrian people, like any people, have the right to rise up to try to overthrow their government. But they don't have the right to demand that we support our country bombing their country in order to bring it about. It's very, very clear. We should be for a democratic revolution in Syria.